Good afternoon. My name is Elise Patterson, and I am a member of the EAB events team. I'm not on screen, so don't worry that you're not seeing me. Before we get started today, I want to go over a few housekeeping items that will help you get the most out of the session. Please feel free to reduce or enlarge the size of your windows as needed. You can do so by clicking and dragging any corner of the window. You can also move these elements around the screen to your desired placement. Closed captioning is available by hovering over the media player and clicking the closed caption button. Please enable the attendee chat by clicking the chat bubble on your console tab. This is where you can interact with other attendees throughout the session. Lastly, if you have a question for the speakers, please use the Q&A window to submit them. Now it is my pleasure to welcome Suba Berry, President of Paramount.
Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, depending on where you're calling in from. Welcome to our panel on what talent leaders need to know about changing precedent in affirmative action. You all know that on October 31st, the Supreme Court heard 2 affirmative action cases brought against 2 institutions of higher education by Students for Fair Admissions. These cases challenge precedent to allow the use of race as one factor among many in college admissions. We are now engaging in a broad-ranging reflection with national experts on the implications of affirmative action on employee diversity. And then let's consider other ways to change precedent, innovating to expand opportunities for historically excluded people. This panel today is part of our Issues and Innovation series, where we explore an issue like affirmative action and then examine some case studies of innovations that could begin to address the issues. So let me start by introducing who's here today. As Elise introduced me, I'm Suba Berry. I'm the president of Paramount. Paramount is an organization that empowers the world's most inclusive workplaces. We are a trusted partner to organizational change agents. We work with over 450 corporations, government entities, and nonprofits globally, and we guide them on their DEI priorities. So it's a pleasure for me to be here today and to moderate the panel. Moderating the chat is my colleague, Pavani Reddy, who is, in addition to leading our public-private partnerships at EAB, has also architected this issue and innovation series. And she is going to be actively moderating your views, your opinions in the chat. Let's now have our panelists introduce themselves. We first have Natasha Wariku, who is a professor of sociology at Tufts, and she's the author of Is Affirmative Action Fair? The Myth of Equity in College Admissions. Natasha?
Thank you. Thank you to Pavani for inviting me onto this panel. I'm looking forward to the discussion. As Sipa mentioned, I'm Natasha Wariku, professor of sociology at Tufts. And my research has been for many years about college access and looking at kind of ideas about merit and meritocracy and affirmative action. So I wrote a book about called The Diversity Bargain, which is about how students on elite campuses make sense of race and meritocracy in college admissions. And then I turned to kind of Asian Americans. And so I have 2 books out this year. One is, as Supa mentioned, is Affirmative Action Fair, which is about how to think about affirmative action, what's some of the empirical data related to affirmative action, how do we think about Asian Americans, and then a book about that goes kind of prior to the college admissions process into high schools at an elite, at a kind of upper middle class suburb that has a large and growing Asian American population, and kind of thinking about some of the tensions around achievement, what's a fair way of getting ahead, how do parents kind of make sense of the kind of competition that their children are engaging in. So yeah, I'll stop there.
Thank you, Natasha. Our other panelist is Stephanie Gold, who is a partner of Hogan Lovells Education Practice, focused on civil rights, compliance, financial aid, accreditation, gainful employment, and ESG. Stephanie?
Hi, thanks so much for including me in this discussion today. So as Subha said, I'm Stephanie Gold. I'm a partner with Hogan Lovells, which is an international law firm. I'm based in Washington, D.C. I head up our education sector practice. And for over 25 years, I've been working with universities and colleges and education associations and education companies on just a whole range of regulatory and legal issues that are particular to higher education, and that includes compliance with the federal non-discrimination laws. Hogan Lovells represented the American Council on Education in its amicus briefs in the Harvard case at each level of the judicial process, and have been active on the topic of affirmative action before the courts in prior cases as well. So thank you very much for having me here today, and I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. We also have Winnie Lado and Zach Maslia. They will be sharing the case studies of innovation in the second hour. So I will formally introduce them at the start of the second hour, but they are also here with us. Natasha, let me start with you. You know, you have this new book, which I held up, The Affirmative Action. Is Affirmative Action Fair? The subtitle is Myth of Equity in College Admissions. Can you give us an overview of what your book is about?
Sure. So let me first say it's a short book. It's about 100 pages. And so this book is really meant to be a primer on just trying to understand affirmative action. So I go through the, what do we know? What are the arguments that people have been making to advocate for affirmative action, to critique it, and then what is the empirical evidence for some of these arguments? And so I kind of go through that systematically and show that, a lot of the critiques are really kind of unfounded in terms of these questions of, is there a mismatch if people go to a higher status college? And that's actually, it's the opposite. They're more likely to graduate. Is it, is this racial discrimination? And help you readers kind of think about that. And then I talk about, there's a chapter on Asian Americans, because some people in the audience may know that in one of the two cases that were heard in the Supreme Court this week, the FFA versus Harvard case, the plaintiffs are actually a group of Asian Americans. And so how do we think about Asian American and achievement and affirmative action? So there's a chapter on that. And I kind of argue throughout the book that the question, is affirmative action fair, is actually the wrong question, because it assumes that college admissions is this kind of individualist meritocracy in which, the college takes all of the applications they have, lines them up in some kind of hierarchy from quote unquote best to worst, and takes the top ones. And that's really not how it works. Colleges are organizations that are trying to kind of further their mission. And I argue that we need to kind of go back to first principles and think about, what are we trying to do here? What is the mission of our university? So most universities talk about teaching, research, and contributing to the common good in society. Some also talk about social mobility. And how do we align our admissions practices with those goals, right? And when we do that, it becomes very clear that we need racial diversity on campus. We need attention to racial disadvantage, in addition to, of course, other forms of disadvantage in opportunity. And so, in the end, I think this book is kind of it's a defense of the practice of affirmative action, but really tries to expand our view and say, let's just, we really need to stop thinking about college admission as affirmative action as this little tweak in a kind of individualist meritocracy to kind of set it right. It's really sort of a part of a broader mission for contributing to a better society. And I think affirmative action plays an important role in that.
You know, Natasha, it's really interesting because what you're telling us is, create a little bit of a redefinition for what this is, because admissions itself, as you said, is not a competitive process. It's not a competition or a certification of an individual's worthiness for a specific line of education. It is at best an imperfect approach to carrying out a selection process, because we always tease kids and say, well, if you're that oboe player and that college needs that oboe player for that band, they're going to pick you irrespective of a lot of other things. So I think what you're saying is fairness is the wrong way to analyze affirmative action if you believe that it is not just purely a merit-based process. Would you sort of agree with that definition of it?
Absolutely. So the last chapter of the book, I say it's from fairness to justice, and really thinking about justice. And I'll just give you an example that came to mind as you were talking. In the hearing, Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson gave this example, and she said, what if you have an applicant? This was in the UNC case because she recused herself from the Harvard case. So she said to the lawyer, if you have an applicant who is from North Carolina, is the fifth generation of, 5 generations in that applicant's family have gone to UNC, and the student says, I would like to honor my family's legacy and go to UNC. And we know, of course, that colleges do take into consideration, are you part of a legacy family? And you have that applicant. And that's a white applicant. And then you have a Black African-American applicant who is also from North Carolina and says, I am, a fifth generation, my family has been in North Carolina for generations. My ancestors were enslaved and were not allowed to have education. And they could not go to UNC because of this. And I would like to honor their legacy by studying at UNC. She said, you're arguing that the former should be allowed, but not the latter. And the lawyer basically said yes. And I think, that's extremely problematic because, when we think about what these colleges are doing, they're really looking at, as you mentioned, the oboe player. And I'm sure that oboe player who gets selected has worked incredibly hard. But what we forget in sort of seeing how they worked so hard and practiced every day is that so many young people never get the opportunity to work hard, have not heard of it, the instrument, could not pick out an oboe in a picture of 10 instruments, right? Never got exposed. Even if they got exposed, family didn't have, the resources to pay for lessons or to get an instrument. And so, when we think about fairness or justice, we need to think about much more broadly than these individual kind of accomplishments.
Thank you, Natasha. Stephanie, can you tell us about the cases that the Supreme Court is hearing? And if you can also sort of include in your comments how long you think it's likely to take the Supreme Court to issue rulings that can actually impact college admissions teams so that we have some context for this?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll give a bit of a primer on the legal framework within which this gets considered. So the court heard 2 cases, as Natasha sort of alluded to. One was called Students for Fair Admissions versus President and Fellows of Harvard College, and the other was Students for Fair Admissions versus University of North Carolina. The 2 cases are separate but similar, and the court, as Natasha said, did hear them in separate arguments. So the UNC case was argued first. The Harvard case was argued second. It was a total of 5 hours of argument. Justice Jackson did recuse herself from the Harvard case because she was on the Harvard governing body during the pendency of the lawsuit against Harvard. Both cases seek to overturn Grutter versus Bollinger, which was a 2003 Supreme Court decision that laid out the blueprint for race-conscious admissions that has been widely used by universities since then. And the core question in the Harvard and UNC cases is whether any consideration of race and ethnicity in the college admissions process constitutes a violation of the Equal Protection Clause of the Constitution and Title VI of the Civil Rights Act. The cases are similar in that the plaintiffs say that the institutions discriminated against white and Asian American applicants during the admissions process by giving extra preference to Black, Hispanic, and Native American applicants. The Harvard College case, and Natasha alluded to this, does go further and claims discrimination against Asian American applicants, which Harvard denies. Both cases were brought by a group called Students for Fair Admissions. As their website explains, Students for Fair Admissions is a nonprofit membership group of more than 20,000 students, parents, and others who believe that racial classification and preferences in college admissions are, and this is quoting from their website, unfair, unnecessary, and unconstitutional. Both Harvard and the University of North Carolina say that they consider race as one of many factors alongside considerations such as extracurricular activities, socioeconomic background, and military veteran status, and that they do so within the constitutional guidelines set by Grutter, which I'll talk about in just a moment. The institutions say that their attempts to use race-neutral ways of diversifying their student bodies have been unsuccessful. So I just want to take a few minutes to contextualize all this. The Supreme Court has issued 3 major cases over the years on the use of race in admissions decisions in higher education. University of California versus Bakke in 1978, Grutter versus Bollinger in 2003, and Fisher versus the University of Texas in 2016. All were closely divided and all sent the basic message that numerical racial quotas are forbidden, but that a holistic approach using race as one factor among many in the admissions process is permissible. So let me just go through what the blueprint that Grutter laid out, and what's being challenged in the Harvard and UNC cases. So the Supreme Court has repeatedly said that racial and ethnic distinctions of any sort are inherently suspect and call for exacting judicial examination. So the fact that an institution might use racial classifications to help minorities does not change that analysis from the court perspective. The standard the court applies is called strict scrutiny, and under that standard, classifications based on race are lawful only if the institution can demonstrate that the program satisfies 2 requirements. First, the institution has to prove that the program serves a compelling institutional interest, and second, the institution must prove that the program is narrowly tailored to further that compelling interest. So with respect to the first prong, the Supreme Court has recognized only 2 objectives that it has found to be compelling justifications for race-conscious decision-making. One is remedying present effects of identified past discrimination by an institution, and the second, which was established in Grutter, is obtaining the educational benefits of a diverse student body in higher education. Notably, the Supreme Court has rejected a number of other justifications that have been offered over the years for race-conscious measures, including remedying societal discrimination. Remedying past discrimination by an institution has tended not to be a justification on which institutions rely because it can be hard to prove, and it can also give rise to other claims of discrimination against the institution. So Grutter really focused on the compelling interest in obtaining the educational benefits that flow from a diverse student body. And the idea of student body diversity is grounded in an institution's education judgment that such a student body is, in the court's words, quote, conducive to speculation, experiment, and creation. So the court expects an institution to be able to really do their homework and demonstrate that they had a reasoned and principled explanation for the academic decision that diversity is a compelling interest. The second prong of strict scrutiny is narrow tailoring, and narrow tailoring requires the institution to prove that it has adequately considered race-neutral alternatives and that the use of race is necessary to achieve the interest in diversity. And if a race is necessary after an institution has given good faith consideration to workable race-neutral alternatives, the institution may not use rigid numeric goals or assign minority applicants a set number of bonus points or use racial quotas. Rather, narrow tailoring requires that the institution give individualized consideration to all applicants. And so this is the approach that's often referred to as holistic admissions, where race is one factor among many. Narrow tailoring also requires an institution to periodically review the need for race, because the court's expectation is that at some point the practice will end. So just to wrap this up, with that framework in mind, the federal courts in Boston and North Carolina had upheld the university's admissions policies. They found that the universities had satisfied strict scrutiny. And what the SFFA is asking the Supreme Court to do is not only reverse those decisions, but also overturn the precedent and prohibit any consideration of race and ethnicity in admissions. And the court will likely issue two decisions, one for the Harvard case, one for the UNC case. It could issue it any time before the end of the term, which is June, the end of June. Typically, though, the court waits until the end of the term to issue its biggest, most closely watched cases. So my expectation would be that we will not see opinions in either of these cases until the end of June 2023.
So, Stephanie, would it be fair to assume that if that's the case, the decisions for the coming year are made, so it's going to impact the following year after that? And I took some things away from Natasha's book. By the way, Natasha, I read your book 3 times. And it's a pretty slim book, but it was so rich with information and data.
Not because it was incomprehensible.
No, not at all. Far from it. It was interesting because what I really loved was the examples you gave of states like Michigan and California, which are prevented from using affirmative action. They both had, I think, Michigan in 2006 and California in 1996, each was prevented from using affirmative action. And then when you look at what happened to Black undergraduate enrollment in Michigan between 2006 and 2021, the enrollment declined from 6% to 4%, while the total percentage of college-age Black students in Michigan actually increased to 19%. I didn't note as to how much it increased by, but it went up. And again, in California state universities between 1997 and 2018, again, declined from 8% to 4%. So what you know is that there is impact that comes in terms of enrollment as a result of, preventing colleges from being able to embrace that. So now I have some questions that I will just put out to both of you, and whoever it is that wants to pick it up, take it. What should the mission of higher education institutions be, and how do you think the admissions process can and should support this mission? And I know we talked about the legacy, we talked about the oboe player, but really give us a little bit of a broader perspective in terms of how else we can look at this.
Natasha, you want to start?
Sure, I can take that question because I talk a little bit about this in the book. When we look at the, there's some analyses that academics have looked at. Well, what is their mission? What do they say they want to do? And most colleges, talk about obviously teaching, research for, many of the research universities, and then contributing to the public good. And this is a very American thing. And, it's kind of ironic. I did some research. I lived in Britain for many years. Those universities are public, but they very much see themselves as sort of separate from society. And in the United States, we see our universities as very much embedded in the society. That's why we have professional schools, schools of education, law schools, medical schools, business schools, because we really see ourselves as how do we connect our research and teaching to the broader good. And so I think we really need to come back to that. And when we do, we see it's hard to, the example that I give in the book is that, it's not entirely obvious why colleges are trying to take the highest achieving students, right, by any metric, right? Because our higher status colleges tend to be the ones with lower admissions rates, right? And there's a sort of correlation between higher status, lower admissions rate, and more resources. So per student spending, the endowment also increases as you increase in prestige and selectivity. So if, higher status colleges have more resources to educate their students, perhaps, we should be admitting the students who have the lowest levels of achievement and, who have, or, the top students from the lowest ranking high schools, because they have the most, they need the most, right? And so, we also know from some research that looks at where you go to college matters, and for future earnings, which is just one measure. But when you look at future earnings, we find that the people for whom going to a higher status college seems to make a difference in future earnings are students coming from working class and poor families who are Black or Hispanic. And, the theory is that, well, those are the students for whom those networks, those sort of, broadening in college probably matters more because they don't have those social networks through their families. Whereas for other students, you might get your first job through an uncle or a neighbor, the father or mother of a childhood friend, but they're not embedded in those networks in the same way. So, I think when we sort of think about mission and contributing to society, contributing to social mobility and to, diversity and leadership, in, broadening people's horizons, it becomes clear that we need a broader student body in most of these places than we have otherwise. And ending affirmative action, as you mentioned, it's already been ended in 9 states. California has not had affirmative action for over 2 decades. It's very clear what happens. Underrepresented minorities enrollment goes dramatically down year upon year. It doesn't come back to affirmative action levels. And then there's a subsequent decline in graduation rates for underrepresented minorities because now they are attending lower status colleges. And then there's a study in California that shows down the line, wages are affected. So Hispanics who apply to University of California colleges after the ban compared to before have 5% lower wages. There's a study of medical schools. There's a 5% decline in underrepresented minorities in medical schools. So if we care about, and we know that, having a same-race doctor, particularly for African Americans, there's some research that shows that their care is better with a same-race doctor. So we know that, affirmative action actually has these very tangible effects on, the people who are going to those colleges, and then down the line on, healthcare, on teaching. We need a more diverse teaching force. So there are all these things that if we care about contributions to society, then it becomes clear that we need attention to race and admission. We need to broaden our student bodies on these selective college campuses.
Well, thank you, Natasha, because that's compelling. And I tried, as you were talking, I was drawing parallels to what we face in workplaces. So we work not with higher ed, but with corporations and other institutions. And there are 2 things that I will tell you that corporations are really waking up to and embracing fully. And one is needing to have their fair share of talent drawn from the available populations in this country.
Yeah.
So do I have my fair share of Black engineers or Black technologists from, or Latina technologists, et cetera? And the reality is, from a customer-facing issue, you also want to be a reflection of your customers. And if the population that uses your products and services is not reflected within your organization, whether it's in all the way from innovation to product creation to marketing to sales, et cetera, you miss something in that, and you miss your fair share of capturing market share from those communities. That's one. And the other part of it to me that's just as interesting is, I always say, we take our very best support offerings, whether in terms of learning and individual development, etc., and we assign it towards quote unquote high potential. So when we hire people, we're not hiring someone saying, oh my God, you're terrible, you're low potential, but I'm going to hire you anyway. Everybody we hire is considered high potential. So where does that chasm happen? Somewhere where someone goes from being high potential to not so high potential, and you will find disproportionately that women and people of color tend to fall off when it comes to being recognized as high potential or not. And then you put all your resources behind the high potential, to the exact point that you're making, that who actually needs the support, who needs that lift, who needs that extra consideration, may be an underrepresented minority student or one that's a first-time college goer, etc. And that is who we end up missing in terms of trying to say, we want everything to be equal as opposed to equitable. And there is the difference. So there are parallels in the corporate side of it. My next question is, if the court does end affirmative action as we know it today, and there is a possibility that that can happen, what do you think would be the impact on college admissions overall?
Should I answer?
You know, either of you, Stephanie, either of you, whoever feels like they have something to add.
I'll offer some observations, and then Natasha, you can jump in. I guess one thing I want to emphasize is that part of this depends on the scope of what exactly the court says in its opinion. So there are some real practical aspects of this. One, there was actually discussion during oral argument about, well, what do you do? And this sort of goes to the example that Natasha was describing. What do you do if a candidate has described in their essay that what their experience has been as a Black person in a predominantly white rural community, and it's in their essay, and it's clear from their essay what their racial background is. If the court goes so far as to say you can't consider race in the admissions process, what does an admission officer do with an essay like that? And that was discussed during the oral argument. Is there some way in which an admissions officer is going to have to kind of ignore all of that? And he actually heard from the SFFA lawyer that no, that kind of an essay could be used to show things like grit or perseverance or other sorts of attributes that would be viewed as somehow race neutral, which I say with some hesitation because I don't know quite what race neutral truly means. But that, so I think where the court what it ends up saying is that this opinion could have some real practical impact for how college admission officers do what they do. From a legal perspective, if they were to end it, I think you would see a lot more move towards strategies to achieve goals using what gets referred to as race neutral methods, like, do you eliminate mandatory testing, increasing recruitment efforts in geographic areas or high schools that have large minority populations, using measures such as socioeconomic background and other sorts of ways of first generation college student to try to accomplish those goals. And I think also it's going to make even more necessary discussion around broader strategies to achieve diversity through means other than the admissions process. And that's where I think Natasha's book really, and she can talk about this, really sort of talked about some of the broader kind of policy ways to think about what do we do if we're not able to use affirmative action. It can't just none of this can depend solely on the admissions process in any event, and this will just heighten the need to be thinking of other strategies as well.
And for both of you, do you think this is just an issue with the elite colleges?
I mean, it is in the sense that, most colleges in the United States aren't practicing affirmative action, in part because most are open admissions, right? They're there's only, out of the, I don't know how many colleges there are in the United States now, but there's only 200 or so that are selective, which is to say that there are more applicants than there is room for, so you're selecting. And it's only when you have selection that you are kind of practicing affirmative action, because you're making these decisions about who you admit and who you don't. And even those colleges that are admitting, 80%, 90%, often it's, do we think the student can handle the workload at our college? It's not we just have 10 qualified applicants for every one place, which is, the case at places like Harvard. And UNC to some extent as well is only selecting 1 in 4 applicants. And so to that extent, yeah, it's really a sort of a lead question. And I think it's worth remembering that there are all these other colleges that are really, our community colleges are where social mobility is happening. Community colleges, big state schools, often the flagships, those are where we are seeing kind of social mobility happen, because they are much more diverse racially and in terms of class. And, just to add to what Stephanie said, I think there'll be other policies like the Texas started this 10% plan, and then it was copied in California, different. I think California was 4%. Florida, I think, also is 10%. Where if you're in the top 10% of your high school, you automatically get admitted to the college of the state school of your choice. So as a way of, unfortunately our schools are segregated, and this, then this can also lead to diversity. But none of these policies has, in other states have brought us back to the levels of underrepresented minority representation that affirmative action can. I think there's other creative solutions, partnerships between selective colleges and community colleges. I think Berkeley is a really nice example of, I forgot what percentage of their student body, but significant number of students are, and their places are reserved for community college transfers, and really partnering with, say, local community colleges to say, hey, if you do well, you've demonstrated that you can be successful in our college. Let's have a kind of formalized program and transfer of credits. I also think we just need broader state support for our public higher education. That the percentage of the expenses of public higher education paid by states has dramatically declined over in the last few decades. And so I think beyond these elites, it's important to sort of think about, well, as a system, higher education system, how do we better provide opportunities?
Well, thank you, Natasha. I'd now like to turn to the audience, and as I had mentioned earlier at the start of this panel, Pavani Reddy will be moderating this chat. My question to you is, how do you think your organization will be impacted at all, if at all, if affirmative action is prohibited in undergraduate admissions? Would love to hear from you about what you think the impact is going to be. Pavani, I hand off to you now.
Absolutely. So everybody, please feel free to hop into the chat. We know it's working, so thank you, Kristen and Rumbi and Halisi. I've posed the question in the chat, and just to repeat it in case you missed it, how do you think your organization will be impacted, if at all, if affirmative action is prohibited in undergrad admissions? And we know we have a broad group in the chat. There's over 50 attendees, and I know you represent a lot of different types of organizations. So go ahead and share a little bit about what you might expect if affirmative action is prohibited in undergrad admissions. Please don't be shy. We would love to hear from you, and I know our panelists would love to be able to engage with you as well.
Well, as people are dropping their responses in, I'd like for the panelists to also think about, in today's day and world, with all of the changes, this is not where things were in the 80s or even the 90s. is there greater awareness around it? And what can corporations do? What can individuals do? Is there an opportunity to do more as opposed to just sort of toe the line with what the Supreme Court is going to weigh down on? Is there a challenge with people entering their responses into the chat? Because if there is, and I would like to make sure, please let us know. How can we find out if people are having trouble with this, Pavani?
I think it's live and active. We've got one chat response. So in response to that original question about how the organization might be impacted, an already narrow pool of underrepresented next generation workers will diminish further. And that's, yeah, I think that is, Megan, thank you for that. I think that is a major concern. And Subha, would you remind me what your second question was?
The second question was really around, with an eye towards increasing diversity, both in college and in the workplace, what are some ways that colleges could be improving their current recruitment and admissions processes? And how do you know, how will they differ across selective versus open access institutions? Okay, what can ways that colleges could be improving their recruitment process to ensure that even with this decision by the Supreme Court, that they can still find other ways, creative, innovative ways to be able to recruit underrepresented minority students? I think we have a few people that have, do you see that, Pavani, in the chat? I'm looking at it, and I see Rosalie says, significantly, we have entire strategies around driving diverse talent into our organization. This change would make it even harder for us to do so. And Ashley Parker says, if this is prohibited, I feel like we might not even realize the full impact on our workforce for a few years. We might be trying to really have to solve for how big of an impact this actually creates years from now. So it's not just about the impact today, but what it could be in the long term. I see Joanne answering. Do any of our panelists have some opinions on this in terms of how they see, ways in which colleges could improve their current recruitment and admissions process, assuming that this comes down on the side of being prohibited?
So, well, one observation I'll make, which Natasha, it was something I think you talk about this in your book, and it really resonates for me too. I guess it flips it a little bit, because if we go back to this idea that really in the scheme of things, it's a very small number of schools that are using race-based admissions policies, I guess the question I have is the role that employers have to be looking at schools beyond sort of the ones that have historically been sort of viewed as the selective schools, and I do think that there are policy, challenges around like why we have these schools that are deemed to be kind of selective, and how what's sort of pushing them to be in that category. But I think there is a need for generally for employers to be kind of, and this will really, I think, force the issue too, to look outside the box and in a way think about what their mission is and where they can be finding their workforce needs satisfied beyond what maybe have been the traditional reflexive institutions to which an employer has gone. I think it sort of highlights that this isn't only on sort of we expect a lot of our universities and colleges, and I get that. I'm a higher ed lawyer. Universities and colleges believe in their mission, but I think this sort of this topic highlights the extent to which diversity and inclusion topics really kind of radiate. It really requires collaboration among many sectors in society, and I think sort of it will make it even more important for universities to be collaborating with employers to think about where they're looking to satisfy their workforce needs.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a really, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, no, please, Natasha, please.
I think that's a really, really important point. You know, when there's some of the research on hiring at elite firms, particularly in, say, management consulting or finance, and you know, it just shows that, you know, these firms are going to very select elite colleges, and then within them, at selecting, basically, you know, students are not looking at students' grades or what they've learned in college. It's like you've gotten into the college, and now, you know, do you kind of like the same, you know, activities as me? Were you in the same fraternity as me? And then there is this kind of social reproduction that has nothing to do with whether the person will actually, you know, contribute to the team. And, you know, even, you know, I had a student, I teach at Tufts, which is one of these very selective colleges, who is, you know, got a summer internship at one of these, you know, elite hedge fund firms. And he was talking about this, and he said, well, you know, they don't recruit at Tufts. The only way I got an interview was through he went to a private high school, through my high school debate coach. And it was like, you know, even at a place like there's so much kind of ranking that is problematic, and that, you know, Tufts is also elite. So like we need to go well beyond a place like Tufts, like UMass Boston, UMass, you know, or some of the community colleges, and really rethink, what are we looking for? What are the skills, and how do we kind of expand our understanding of who can fill those roles?
Yeah. And Natasha, many of your thought here is echoed in one of these comments. So Julie mentions, I think corporations play a huge role in advancing diversity. So corporations invest big dollars on college campuses to have the privilege to recruit, build their brands. And with that investment, there's also the ask as we come to campus to be able to recruit, to want to see diversity. So this is kind of a, you know, in support of that idea. We want diversity on the capstone projects we provide, internships. And then this, Laura also says, universities can't have it both ways, not to have affirmative action, but to want the corporate dollars and corporate support.
Yeah, I mean, most universities that are selective do want affirmative action, and we, you know, all the studies of like admissions offices, like they're, you know, it's not the universities that are ending this practice. It's, you know, whether it's a state referendum or a legislature, or, you know, now this sort of lawsuit, the U.S. Supreme Court. So I think there is alignment there. It's just unfortunately, you know, that.
You know, one of the things we talk about, you know, when it comes, for example, to corporate boards where we've needed and asked and demanded more diversity, there is to say, who rolled over and said your size should only be 8 or 10 or 12? Why can you not grow the size? So, you know, as opposed to saying I'm going to turn down somebody and it's a zero-sum game, well, grow the pie. These elite institutions have enormous endowments, and the ability for them to be able to use part of that to, you know, fuel more aid to students that come. I mean, perhaps that's another way to do it. You know, instead of priding yourself on the selectivity of, oh, I only take 1%, 2%, 4%. I think you pride yourself on growing that pie and actually admitting more students into your university.
Absolutely. I mean, there's a really great paper by this economist, Peter Blair, and he looks at which colleges have expanded and what that says about kind of eliteness. And basically, he concludes that, you know, over the last 50 years, more, 60, since the 1950s, higher education has dramatically expanded in the United States. But the elites have not expanded very much. But where we see the growth is in community colleges, is in state schools, and those are the places that have expanded the pie. Whereas the elites have been pretty stubborn about, like, well, we can't grow and we can't, we are not going to expand the pie. And I really think that needs to be rethought. I absolutely agree with you, Siva, on that point.
Well, there are a couple of comments in the Q&A box, so I'm going to read them out. Rosalie says, we have so many technology tools that provide us information about where we can drive diverse entry-level talent, where we need to fulfill those workforce gaps. We're also challenging our managers to think about, are degrees really a sign of success for roles? And we're thinking about strategies beyond a college university play for true diverse talent. And she then says, significantly, we have entire strategies around driving diverse talent into our organization, and this change would make it even harder for us as well. Well, thank you for that. We will soon be exploring 2 case studies that will sort of flip the script. But before we do that, I want to engage the audience in a couple of poll questions. Would you, Pavani, would you take us away to the poll questions, please, and launch them?
Absolutely. So I have one poll up on the screen. If folks can see that, I'm going to go ahead and read things out for people who are on the move or otherwise can't see these. So the question is, what practices does your firm use to increase diversity? Select all that apply. The first option is career fairs and panels for diverse audiences. B, technology platforms for diverse audiences. C, diversity talent sourcing firms. D, anti-bias training and hiring. E, learning and development. F, mentoring, and G, other. And so I'm going to just let that run for a few, maybe 30-ish seconds, because we want to give people a chance. And I see some percentage of attendees have been able to submit their answers. So please keep those answers coming in.
It's always interesting to see, the various levers that organizations seem to pull in terms of trying to find success here. And I wish I could tell you that there was one clear, clean-cut way in which to do this, but there isn't. When we find it, I know we would have found the Holy Grail, but we're not there yet. Mm-hmm.
All right, we'll give folks just a couple more seconds to add in their response, and then I'll go ahead and show the results. All right, so what would our panelists say in terms of looking at this? And now remember that, selecting multiple of these was possible.
It's interesting because I would say to you, from my perspective, this is probably what I would have expected. But, the ones that I think are going to get to the front is going to be things like using technology for diverse audiences, figuring out technological solutions, because that is the one that probably has not been utilized as much. And even though anti-bias training and hiring comes up, it's important to note that it's in-time training, meaning to say not a quiz or something you take or a video you watch at the beginning of the year and do it once a year, but rather in time, watch a vignette, do something right before you're entering in to go do an interview, so that is top of mind, as opposed to, and it's a much shorter one, but it immediately places this notion of, yes, you have bias as you go into this interview, figure out strategies and ways to mitigate that and be able to put that into play.
And it does seem that the very first option A, career fairs and panels for diverse audiences, kind of speaks to that point of corporations visiting college campuses to recruit diverse applicants.
Yep. Any comments from our panelists about this? Any surprises here? If not, let's go to this. Oh, sorry. Please go. Please.
I guess one thing one observation I have that is sort of adjacent to what this is showing is that I do think that universities and colleges need to be thinking about diversity and inclusion beyond admissions. So it includes things like how the curriculum is designed and the pedagogies that are used and the courses that are offered, as well as enrollment efforts that look at outreach and recruitment and scholarship and admissions. And then what's the student life like at the institution? Because I think those can have collateral benefits. The inclusion piece can really ultimately, I think, affect the diversity piece. So I think some of what's here kind of gets at, that concepts around like how to make the workplace and how to make the campus more inclusory as well.
You're right. And they continue to be very, very challenged by diversity in faculty, which has remained a challenge in higher education. And it was so for a long time in schools and still is in high schools. So you need to again have a reflection of the student population you're going to embrace and bring in the ranks of the teachers and hopefully the administrators in the higher ed institution. And also, I want to call out mentoring as way, in the corporate world, we talk about sponsorship because that is that one lever that allows you to leapfrog and get that step forward that otherwise takes forever and sometimes completely is not within reach for individuals that are underrepresented minorities. Pavani, would you launch the second poll, please?
Yes, absolutely. So I'll read this one out as well. Where do you struggle the most when it comes to diversity? A, identifying diverse candidates. B, hiring diverse candidates. C, identifying bias in your application hiring process. D, promoting diverse candidates. E, compensating diverse candidates at parity with white employees. All of the above. So I'll give that a good 30, 45 seconds. Folks can start. This one, probably folks need to think about a little bit more where they struggle the most. Is this one live? I'm not seeing what I typically see on this.
It looks like the radio buttons aren't live, Pavani.
You'll once you finish the poll, once you call it, you can then go to that next slide and it'll come up and show you the percentages.
There it is.
Okay, I just refreshed this. So good. Attendees, please try again. If you tried before, I think they might now be live.
We love technology, but we need it to love us also.
Yes, they're coming in now.
Good, fantastic. We just have a few more minutes actually before we have to close this part of the session, and before we move over to Wenny and Zach.
Okay, I'll go ahead and show these results. They're coming in quick, so I'm letting folks, because I know we had that little glitch. All right. What do we think of these responses here? Clear winner in A, or not a winner, but the most significant challenge, identifying diverse candidates.
Hiring, identifying bias. I'm surprised that compensating diverse candidates at parity with white employees is not seen as, I'm sure it's covered in the all of the above, but I'm surprised that it doesn't come up as one of the issues. But I guess the question is, where do you struggle the most? So people are going to pick one, because I don't think it's you can pick multiple ones. Okay.
Seems that they struggle the most in identifying diverse candidates.
Yeah, yeah. Stephanie and Natasha, any other parting remarks from you? Again, in advance of these rulings, what can both corporations do? What can college admissions departments do? Any tips, any pointers that you may have for both these constituencies?
I think that, related to this last question, these last two polls, that, the research on just how do we get more underrepresented folks into kind of management, it seems pretty clear that mentoring, it was interesting that mentoring was sort of not one of the bigger practices, but mentoring programs have the most success on getting more women and minorities into management positions. So just, as Stephanie said, it's getting people in the door is just the first step. And then how do we make sure that there is a pipeline to promotion as well? So that's one thing that I just wanted to point out.
Thank you. Stephanie, any parting words?
Yeah, I think related to that, and this has sort of been a theme, I think that, it really ultimately on college campuses, which tend to be pretty decentralized. I mean, it can be a challenge at universities and colleges that people tend to operate in silos. And I think if, to really accomplish what needs to be accomplished here, multiple units at an institution need to be working together to figure out those strategies and solutions across functional areas, to accomplish diversity goals and within the, as the lawyer, I'll point out within the parameters of the law. And I do think that there are opportunities for universities and colleges to work to sort of strengthen relationships with third parties outside of the campus gates. So working with high schools and other institutions, I think those community college articulation type of arrangements are really terrific, and working with employers to explore ways in which opportunities can be opened beyond just how the admissions process is used as a tool.
Well, I want to thank our panelists. They were phenomenal. Thank you so much, Natasha. Thank you again, Stephanie. And we appreciate your time, your wisdom, your insights, and really look forward to continuing this dialogue and conversation. We will now have a short break. Pavani, is that a 5-minute break we're going to take? So we can transition to Winnie and Zach. And we will see you back here, go get a cup of coffee, glass of water, take a quick bio break, and be back. We will start again in 5 minutes. Hello there.
Hey, Suba.
All right, folks.
Hi. Are we back? It is, I'm looking at the time, it's 3:40 Eastern Time, and welcome back. And before we get started, could we have people put in the main chat who they are, where they're from, your name, your company, and how you think it's going so far? We'd love to hear from you. Okay, so as I introduce our next two speakers, please feel free to go in and give us some information about you so we get a sense for, we know your names, but we don't know which company and how you like what we've done so far. So welcome, Zach Maslia. He's a manager of strategy and new ventures at EAB, and focused on innovating to create more representative talent pipelines for our corporations and from the ranks of our students in the universities we serve. And Wendy Lado, Senior College Success Manager at College Greenlight at EAB, again, who's innovating to improve college access. So let me hand off to the two of you to take over from here.
Awesome. Thanks, Suba. It's really great to be with you all today. I'm really thrilled to have this opportunity to share with you some of the initiatives that our Greenlight team have been working on in the last year, as well as having this opportunity to engage in a conversation with Zach. I think it's really important that we recognize that higher education, as we think about undergraduate students, eventually there's a pipeline to the corporate space or the workforce. And so let's think about these opportunities in which we are thinking about bias or how affirmative action might influence decision-making, problem-solving, etc. And so we're excited to share with you some of the nuances that we've incorporated in our work today. So I'll take the first stab in describing the work that we do with College Greenlight. College Greenlight is a leading college admissions advocacy network. We unite a collective of educational advocates to increase college access and completion for underrepresented and historically underserved students. So when you think about this conversation of higher education, we are in the undergraduate space. We are supporting the enrollment concept of higher education. So as institutions think about the students that they're bringing to campus, they often have this time to discuss diversifying their student population. And so at College Greenlight, we aim to connect institutions with students as well as community-based organizations that are helping students get more access to college, and particularly students who are coming from first-generation backgrounds, students who are underrepresented, and we use underrepresented as a broad term at Greenlight because we want to make sure that we're not just including this conversation about race and ethnicity, but we want to think about geography. We want to think about socioeconomic status. We also want to think about variable entities to one identity as institutions seek to connect with students. And so our community-based organizations, we have over 1,400 across the country, and these community-based organizations are working independently with students either through charter schools or school networks or specified community-based organizations like College Horizons or College Chicago Scholars. And these are organizations that I just mentioned that are privately funded. There are also some organizations that are government funded. So if you know about the TRIO programs that exist out there, those are programs that the government has put to support students who are first generation, are coming from low income backgrounds, or have a disability, documented disability or learning disability. So this is an opportunity for us to identify the different characteristics of organizations who are working with these students. And typically these students are underserved in their communities. So therefore it gives the students and the counselors an opportunity to connect with colleges across the country. So we work with over 400 college partners of all different types. And so we are advocates of education in general. We're not just talking about the highly selective institutions. We're not just talking about solely community colleges. We're talking about the spectrum of higher education to help students have a better understanding of what opportunities are out there for them. And then on top of that, we think about information and opportunity gaps that exist as students and counselors are advocating for higher education. So whether it is conversations about affordability, conversations about sense of belonging, understanding what school might be the right fit for a student, whether it's the academic component, the career component, there are many different elements that students take into consideration and counselors take into consideration as they advise students in this process of searching for college. So that's a little bit about who we are. And I think what I've loved the most about College Greenlight is that I really always try to take the student perspective in the work that we do and highlight that significantly as we think about different initiatives. And so I want to talk about one new initiative. Zach, you're welcome to turn the slide. And this is an initiative that we call Greenlight Match. And it was piloted last year, and so this year we're in our second year. And this is an opportunity to reimagine the traditional application process for students. And so we know that searching for college can be challenging, but oftentimes students are most aware of the most known institutions, thinking of the Ivy Leagues to thinking about the public flagships, etc. But we want students to realize that they can have additional opportunities to interact with institutions that they may have not considered. So Greenlight Match, reimagines the traditional college process. And we want this to be an opportunity, or we use this model where students can complete a profile, and Concourse is the base for the application base that we use here. And this is a moment where students actually get to create a profile. And when they create a profile, it can ask questions about their interests, and then there's questions or segments about their transcript, their schooling, etc. But what's important about the student profile is that it's anonymized through the process. And so the students' counselors are the one who are verifying and ultimately nominating these students for this match program. So once students complete their file, once they're nominated by a counselor, then their files are actually sent to our college partners. Our college partners review those students' applications, and based off of the criteria in which they have, or the students might align with their mission or their institution, the colleges get to make the decision. And so then after that, the students get to start getting messages or acceptance letters from these institutions. They're only going to be seeing some good news. And so as you think about this model, it really helps for students who might feel that intimidation factor of applying to colleges. They get to do this and realize, you know what? I get to share who I am, but I don't have to think about all of the complications or barriers that might exist in the process as individuals might review my application. Should they know my name? Should they know my race and my identity? Should they know additional information that can make people more biased through the process? And so this is a really great opportunity for students to expand their opportunities by connecting with multiple institutions or receiving multiple admissions letters from institutions across the country. Our institutions who partner with us also have some different components to their support. So if they match with a Greenlight student, it's an opportunity for them to say, hey, we will meet 100% of demonstrated need for our Greenlight match students, or we have some additional funding that we can provide for our Greenlight students, or Greenlight match students. And so this is a really new way for our students and our counselors to engage in this process. It is not a heavy lift. So that's the other process that exists here, is that it is long and it can be daunting for students to repeat this application process, write a lot, share a lot, etc. And so this is a application that makes it a little bit more accessible for the students as well as the counselors in terms of saving some time and energy there. So that's a Greenlight Match. I know many of you might have tons of questions, but after Zach introduces the work that he's doing, we'll have some discussion to further talk about, you know, the influences of affirmative action through the application process. So that was Greenlight Match.
Awesome. And as you'll see, is often the case, I'm stealing ideas from Winnie and learning from all the incredible work that she's doing. So happy to sort of talk about that next generation of student success, as Winnie alluded to earlier, not just how do you find and succeed at a school, but then how do you think about that next step in the journey in terms of that college to career jump. And so that is really the sort of entree into this new initiative that we're launching right now in the Career Equity Initiative, sort of a new pilot as we're sort of rethinking from some of the learnings that we've taken from the enrollment space in terms of how do we better support historically excluded and underrepresented students in their college search process. How do we continue that through the student success continuum into the career search process? And as Winnie said, I think always top of mind for us before we dive into sort of building something new or think about how we can better support students in their journey is wanting to get on the ground and talk to those who will be engaging with this platform and this potential initiative. And so one of the first things that we did was we said, hey, we want to talk to students and we want to talk to talent acquisition teams that are in this process today and understand how the current systems that we use and the sort of way that we're connecting students to career opportunities, particularly historically excluded students, where there might be gaps and how we might be able to improve that system for students here. And so what you see on the left-hand side of the page is really some of the key points we heard from talent acquisition professionals as we talked to them about their sort of diversity recruiting efforts or their efforts to sort of improve representation across their talent acquisition pipelines. And a lot of it is sort of echoed from what we heard in the first hour from Stephanie and Natasha and Suba. The first thing that we heard sort of time and time again from talent acquisitions professionals was that when they're thinking about improving representation, they're often limited because they go to sort of the same set of campuses year over year to recruit talent. And oftentimes these are some of those more 200 selective colleges, universities, where, to I think Stephanie's point or Natasha's point earlier, the vast majority of sort of historically underrepresented students, whether that's across race, whether that's across first-gen status, low-income status, diversity is obviously broadly defined, much more beyond just race and ethnicity. A lot of those students are actually at schools that are beyond the sort of more selective college universities. And so there are real opportunities for employers to think about how do we get into those larger regional state universities, community colleges as well, to find talent and provide those bridges to be able to path students into great careers and opportunities. I think we heard from a lot of talent acquisition professionals in sort of a post-COVID world, there was more of a push to go to this more campus agnostic recruiting model that got us really excited to say, yes, we should be looking beyond just sort of those 10 to 20 schools you always recruited from. But we think there's sort of an even greater effort that a lot of talent acquisition professionals told us as EAB, who have those deep partnerships with these institutions, to be able to say which schools are right for me based off my geography, based off the types of students I'm looking to engage with. And they're really excited about that connection point between the relationships with higher ed institutions and their students and the employer world. The second thing we heard from employers is sort of in this middle bullet on the left-hand side, where we heard that talent acquisition teams are stretched super thin, which I have a ton of respect for the incredible work that TA teams are doing, because there's a lot on your plate. And what we heard is that for just increasingly, there's so many resumes that come through applications, and it's a really strenuous and manual process to really try to get through all of those resumes and applications. And in some cases, we heard employers say, sometimes I don't even get to review every single candidate that comes through my ATS. And so what this really sort of led to, these two things on the left-hand side from the employer, is sort of in this third bullet, where we heard that a lot of employers were resorting to certain filters like GPA or major to sort of find and engage talent. And what we've seen in that, and what the literature shows us, is that sometimes when we use blunt force instruments like GPA to filter candidates into our pipelines, just from a purpose of making it sort of a less manual experience and try to deal with that high volume, oftentimes those are really poor instruments for predicting future success, and particularly for historically excluded students. It's well documented that first-gen students, low-income students, and other students from historically underrepresented areas have other responsibilities when they're on college campuses, and oftentimes might not have as much time to be reflected in their GPA. And so when we use certain indicators like that to sift through and filter talent, oftentimes we're actually biasing our process at the very beginning, where we're not able to actually aggregate sort of a more holistic view of a candidate and their professional potential. But just as important as the employer side is that view of the students. And when we spoke to students, when we did surveys, a couple things popped up on their side of this system as well. The first thing, which I think is probably not unfamiliar to all of us, we saw this across all students, was that for lots of them, when they're going through that career search process, it wasn't always clear, which roles were a great fit for them based off of the job descriptions alone. And oftentimes students told us that they would read job descriptions, they would check out company pages, but they weren't really able to sort of hone in on which ones might be a great fit for them. Oftentimes we would hear, I would see the term business development representative, and it sounded like a big, scary title and something that might not be a great fit for me, when in actuality, all of us in the corporate world know that that's sort of entry-level sales role that lots of folks from a lot of different backgrounds, capabilities, and skills could really be successful in. And so breaking down those barriers in terms of translating which opportunities, which companies align to the interests, the values of the students is sort of one big thing that popped out at us. The second thing that we heard from students is sort of what we were alluding to a little bit earlier, when a lot of students, particularly for historically excluded student groups, they have a ton of responsibilities when they're on campus. And so for lots of them, when we were speaking to them about that career search process, they told us that they don't have as much time to dedicate to that career search process as they would like because there are other things they're worrying about, whether it's, balancing working while in school or taking care of family members and the like. They have other responsibilities that limits that time to go through the career search process as it is today, where you're doing tons of cover letters, applications, resumes, and you're sort of leading to this bottom bullet on the right-hand side where you have this sort of apply and pray process where students told us that they were just looking at lots of jobs that looked vaguely interesting to them and just shooting out resume applications and cover letters, which we all know is probably not the most efficient and best way to go about as a student, but it's sort of how we're left to sort of fend for ourselves as students in the current environment. And so hearing this, it really echoed back to some of those similar dynamics that Winnie was talking about in that enrollment space. And that really got us excited in thinking about, is there a way to improve that model of the sort of college to career connection through a very similar approach that our enrollment teams have taken from the Greenlight Match work and the incredible work they're doing there to really think about how do you streamline that process for both employers and students? Students have so much on their plate in terms of needing to do numerous applications, numerous cover letters, and finding the right employers. And at the same time, employers likewise have so much on their plate in terms of finding the right schools and students to sort of engage at the top of funnel and finding the right ones that could be, really well aligned to certain roles and things at their organization. And so how do you sort of improve that experience from both sides? And what we've envisioned here through this pilot in the Career Equity Initiative is a universal job application, so a common application of sorts that takes in a more holistic view of the student and their professional potential. So looking beyond things that might typically be on a resume or just a student's major and GPA to get into a deeper profile of the student and what they're looking for in those post-grad career outcomes. So looking at psychographics in terms of what are some of the qualities that the students are looking for in a company. Do you care more about work-life balance, or do you care more about compensation? Do you care more about teamwork or roles that have more individual work? And being able to create a more holistic view of that student and begin to match them to opportunities that could be a really good fit for them that they might not have thought about previously because they did not really know which opportunities could be really well positioned for them. And the same thing that helps on the employer side is that this platform enables you to just sort of define all the different ways a student could be successful. So it's valuable to have extracurricular experience, it's valuable to have work experience, but we know students, might have some in one area but not in the other, and ensuring that we're elevating really a more representative pool of talent for you to engage with, knowing that students from across all the different types of universities that we work with could be really great fits at your organization. And so through that process right now, we're actually piloting this initiative with a handful of our corporate partners and our higher ed partners to really test this idea. Can we bake in sort of a more holistic job matching process and review process where when people are reviewing profiles of students, for example, we have them anonymized, as Winnie mentioned earlier, and we don't include things like GPA because we know that these oftentimes allow things like bias to creep into that evaluation process when you're trying to find candidates that could be really successful at our organization. And so in this pilot period, we've really sort of narrowed the scope to just a small set of roles across juniors and seniors in terms of the types of opportunities that our corporate partners are offering. But what we're really excited excited to have launched this past fall recruiting cycle and seeing how this takes shape and if it can really impact, helping historically excluded student populations find really great opportunities that are a great fit for them. And while it's a little early to read out on success, I'll just share that we're really sort of encouraged by these sort of early results around helping these students find opportunities they might not have thought about before, and likewise helping these employers and talent acquisition teams get in touch with students that they might have been historically overlooking at some of these incredible campuses that we work with. And so I could, as you can see, go on for much longer, rambling about this, but I know Winnie has a lot of incredible things tied up for us to sort of walk through and discuss after this, but would welcome any questions that you all have about the Career Equity Initiative as we're going through this.
Mm-hmm. Feel free to just put those questions in the main chat, questions and comments, and that way we can respond to all of them.
Yeah.
Perfect.
Thanks.
And before, sorry, I was just going to say, before we go, we can dive into those 2 poll questions quickly, and then we can pivot to our discussion if that makes sense. So I think the first poll question we have here for the talent acquisition folks on the line and the higher ed folks on the line is, we are still in this pilot mode of the Career Equity Initiative, but if we continue this initiative forward, would love to hear if there's any interest among participants in being considered for future participation in sort of the second or third rounds of the launch of this platform. And so answer A is yes, answer B is no, and answer C is maybe. So I'll give a couple seconds, maybe 10 to 20 seconds for folks to provide those results. Then we can move to the second poll question.
And while you're giving that, Zach, maybe you could answer, how might a corporation get involved? So maybe just give us an idea of how you pulled together the initial cohort of corporations and what the future might look like.
Yeah, it's a great question, and Pavni, thanks for elevating that. I think our initial cohort of employers was really around some of the folks that have the similar types of recruiting for certain positions, knowing that we wanted to ensure that the scope was relatively narrow. But as we go forward, we'll be making decisions over the next few months in terms of whether this makes sense for us to launch on a larger scale. And so if folks showcase interest in being considered for further participation over the next few months, if we decide to move forward with this, we can sort of reach out and get in contact with you and your talent acquisition teams to sort of enable you to be a part of that beta cohort. And so I think we've had a couple seconds for folks to respond. And so I'll click through to the responses, and a nice split across a couple of different answers here. Know that there's a lot of things going on and lots of different solutions folks are working with today. And then the last poll that we'll have before we pivot back to Winnie, it will come, I think, after our final conversation. So I'll go back to Winnie, and so we can get back to the facilitation of the discussion.
Yes. Thanks, Zach, for walking us through your new initiative, as it's really important for us to think about today's conversation. First, we started off talking about affirmative action and how race plays a significant role in how institutions have evaluated, or specifically those institutions who take a holistic review approach, evaluate students. And so I think where we can start in this discussion, and Natasha and Suba and Pavani, you're all welcome, to share your insights. But we want to talk about what was mentioned in the hearing, and this is the word diverse. And so when we think about diverse candidates, when we think about diversity, do we actually ultimately have a discussion? And the reason why we ask this question is because I think often in the admissions process, we seek to find undertones of racial identity, undertones of class, undertones of bias that ultimately connect us to saying no, or differentiating the experience for students or the experience for people who are seeking jobs. And so when we think about this term diversity, what are we talking about? And so I would be curious, Zach, as you've tapped into this world and thinking about the corporate space, what is diversity for the corporate space? Is it really about race and ethnicity, or is it about talent? What is talent, and how do we qualify talent through this discussion?
Yeah, it's a great question, Winnie, and I think it is, of course, beyond things like just race and ethnicity. Of course, it's to other identity groups and backgrounds. When you look at gender, when you look at disability status, first-gen status, low-income status. So knowing that we all bring various parts of identities and no one identity is representative of that single identity. But beyond that, we think that it is from sort of an educational background as well. What we're hoping this Career Equity Initiative can signal and showcase is that there might be pieces of a student's profile and pieces of a student's background that showcase them as being really great fit for your future talent in your organization. And so not just looking for folks who only are computer science majors, but knowing that there could be a literature major who took 1 or 2 computer science classes or had a project outside of the workforce that actually makes them a really good fit for your organization. So being able to map and have sort of a machine learning algorithm to help map some of those different qualities of students that helps you open that aperture to really define, who is actually qualified for certain roles, looking beyond things like major and GPA.
Mm-hmm. I also think that skill sets play a significant role here. As much as we might be identifying, parts of somebody's identity and, their background and their history, but how are we really evaluating skill? And that's the same kind of question as we think about the application process for students. How do I identify where that skill set is for the student, whether they've mastered, math, calculus, whether they have, a strong sense of writing. Those are the areas of focus, because that also helps us think about performance. And so it's often that, when we're looking at jobs or thinking about jobs, we're writing down our skills, but what value is placed upon our skills, then the value placed upon our name, our institution, affiliation, etc. And so I think about, myself, I was a vocal performance major in college. And so a lot of people just thought that that was my career path, was to be in music. But sometimes we inform our students that you have an opportunity to follow your passion or major in your passion. But if your institution is providing you those opportunities to hone in on additional skills that you can transfer to jobs or opportunities, that's going to be significantly more valuable to the individual as they enter the workforce than it is just siloing a student or siloing, individuals into a certain, academic area. So I do really appreciate you sharing that, because, it is difficult. And so I'm curious, for those of you who are listening in, feel free to put in the chat, but, talk about how you quantify or qualify skill as you are reviewing an applicant. And when are you trying to identify racial undertones or bias undertones based off of, education, etc. But that's just really important. And I think, ultimately, we'll talk about this a little bit later, but bias is the biggest issue here, right? It is the reason why we're here. And so if we can break it apart to really understand if bias shows up consciously, unconsciously, what can we do to inform one another that, hey, this might be a really great candidate because I'm looking at their skills, I'm looking at their experiences that they're providing, X, Y, and Z, and so on. So any commentary from Pavani, Shubha, Natasha about diverse candidates?
I wanted to tie your sort of recent point about bias to a previous comment by one of the attendees around the bias around having a completed degree. So one of the things that strikes me about both of the innovations or the flipped models that each of you shared is, this opportunity to potentially to connect with students who have a degree in process, and maybe have some college, but not yet a completed degree or certificate. Right. I don't know if you've thought about the platforms being capable of expanding in that way, but one of the attendees had mentioned, do we need to rethink as employers whether we're absolutely, whether it's absolutely necessary that the candidate have a completed degree?
I personally think yes.
Yeah, well, but Pavani, I will tell you that there is one more element to it, and that is generational. This next generation that's entering the workplace, which is soon going to overtake all the previous generations in terms of their size and spread within our workplaces, the Gen Z population, has two very interesting attributes that they come to us with. One is they are driven by finding the nexus of their passion and their abilities and skills. They are not willing to compromise to just take on a job that's going to pay them something. They want to keep looking for that role. And perhaps, I'm a parent to a Gen Zer, and I will tell you, I hopefully have afforded them that luxury of being able to say, it's okay. They're willing to make sacrifices in order to find that right role and right job. And that doesn't always align with exactly what they studied. So I think that many more of them will find their superpowers, and we should be that lucky that they choose to come work in our organizations and allow us to be able to mine and leverage that. So that's one side of it. The second one of it is they're saying that Gen Z is far more like the baby boomers in terms of their attitudes towards their companies. When they find something they like, they're not so quick to shift and move on. So the ability to trust and believe that they will be loyal long-term employees is greater than that of the previous generation. Millennials are not so much so. So there are some interesting underlying characteristics of this generation that actually lends itself to us making an investment in understanding what it is that they can offer us and be able to match them to the right roles in the right culture and the right organizations in order to be able to get, enduring, long-term, satisfied, contributing employees.
I'd like to jump in.
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. This is Megan, and I'm a senior advisor on the Saramount team. Thanks again for doing this today. And I'm a colleague with Suba and also others on the phone here today. One of the things that I think is important to keep an eye on, and I think is really relevant to this conversation, and Winnie, you brought it up too, about skills-based hiring, skills-based, looking for roles and candidates, along within the conversation about the college degree, is there is a notion coming about, and maybe some of you have already heard of it, but because we're familiar with the glass ceiling, which was the ceiling for women and advancement in organizations in corporate America, the bamboo ceiling for those that identify as Asian in some cases. And now we have what's called the paper ceiling, which is the barrier to bachelor's degrees, of those that do not have bachelor's degrees in coming into jobs and opportunities. So I do think it's interesting to think about it and look at it in terms of how that's becoming more of a conversation piece. And then the shift towards skills-based hiring, skills-based promotions, skills-based opportunities within organizations, because organizations, for example, LinkedIn had their annual Talent Connect conference last week, and their platform is also shifting. So their LinkedIn recruiter platform is shifting along with those trends to really try to connect people and job seekers with the values of organizations and then organizations with skills that people bring versus their network, whether it's their colleges, who they know, where they're coming from in terms of their social pieces, to be able to get to that larger sort of aperture that we keep talking about and widening that pool, as it is so critically important, because we're all, as employers, looking at the same populations, looking at the same pools, and there's lots of us competing for that. So the idea of opening it further, similar to the college and university sort of selectivity and affirmative action conversation, has a lot of weight here in this employer conversation as well.
Thanks, Megan. That's just an excellent point, especially too, if we think about what just happened in the last 2 years. The pandemic has interrupted this process of skill-based learning and development, not only for adults, but also for young learners. And so as you think about the future of the workforce, some students are saying, I'd rather not go to college right after high school, because they were allowed to work during the pandemic and they were allowed proud to receive, those dollars that they know that they can use to support themselves or support their families. And so when they come to you down the road and you see this gap in their, work history, what is your evaluation there? What really can be your evaluation, and what bias in a negative way are you going to use to influence your reason to say no? But instead, why are you looking to see those skills that, the individual may have developed in their time, not in college, not studying, because that's really important. And then the other point I want to make is just thinking about job descriptions. I know Zach and I talk about this all the time. When an individual looks at a job description saying you're looking for all of these skills, say that you're looking for this experience, I always love to talk about the DEI positions. Most often than not, corporate companies are saying, hey, we're looking for a DEI manager, but they need to have 5 to 8 years of experience. There's no curriculum in colleges that prepare individuals to go into DEI work. So when you're thinking about who's going to come into your pipeline or who's coming into the workforce, are we really setting them up for success? Or are we telling them you have to wait for a very, very long time before you might begin this job, before you can enter into this work? And so sometimes we are recreating barriers for students as well as people seeking out jobs, especially as we think about our historically excluded populations in the U.S. So, Megan, I really appreciated that comment. Yeah. Natasha, any insights that you would like to provide?
This is great. I really love the work that you're doing, and that Zach, you're doing with your initiative as well. I was just thinking about badging and badges, and how much, Zach, is that a part of because I was just trying to figure out, so what are the things that we're sort of looking at, and what kinds of signals can young people who, as you mentioned, Wendy, maybe don't have a college degree or are not being, at a college that's going to recruit, but, if you can say, I know, have a badge that says, I know how to program in X, or I have this kind of skill, like how much of a role is that playing? And is that sort of a mechanism for increasing the diversity in the workforce that sort of, signals to employers as a kind of signaling mechanism?
Yeah, Natasha, I think that's a great point. And I think that focus on how do we get beyond the 4-year institutions, the 2-year, to really find learners where they are and understanding that they have really qualified skills and backgrounds that would add a ton to our corporate environments is really important. And I think that our hope is over the long term, as you're able to begin to build out those pathways and showcase, when you widen that aperture, look at candidates more holistically, you'll be able to map some of those skills, the courses that they've taken, because at EAB we are able to connect into student information systems and the curriculum on campus. We'll be able to tie how certain skills map well to success over time in different roles, and be able to help students path into those different opportunities. Say you come on campus and you're saying, oh, I'm not sure what I want to do, but I am sort of a vocal major, Winnie, or sort of something within sort of the liberal arts, but you might want to go into something that is a more hard skill focused industry. You'll be able to understand how you can map into that. And I think that would hopefully be able to be broadcast out more broadly outside of the higher ed space to say, oh, maybe there are opportunities to take a boot camp, to take sort of online credentialing learning opportunities, to be able to get those badges, get those skills to map and go into these roles that they could be a great fit for.
I also think that higher education curriculum can be more, I would want to say, hands-on with allowing for individuals to learn about those skill sets. So as you learn about the education or the historical context as to what you might be majoring in, the applicability of going into the workforce actually can revert back, for some students, because they're not prepared for the cultural dissonance that's existing there. They're not prepared for the generational dissonance that might exist there. They're not prepared for hierarchy. They're not prepared for maybe the hustle that one might describe in terms of beginning at the job at an entry level and then working their way up. And so how can institutions be more attentive to the applicability of their skill sets within careers that they might be interested in, giving them a little bit more exposure to that? Or if companies like the ones here are willing to do some of that work of of how can we actually activate the learning here of these skill sets and see these, people in action, so that the students who we might be looking to, enroll or admit or hire into our, jobs or our organizations, we at least know they've been able to learn and lean into those skill sets. And I think that could be a huge, huge change maker in the way that individuals transition into the workforce. Yeah. Any other thoughts about, this world of talent, this world of selectivity, actually? So this is actually really a conversation about selectivity, not just in the admissions world, but also in the employment world. And so what are some additional insights or perspectives that we should take into consideration as we support, as we advocate, as we get our communities together to support and elevate students or, individuals into the workforce?
Yeah, I'd be interested, Winnie, I think to that point, how many folks maybe in the chat or sort of attending have opportunities to sort of engage certain populations, historically excluded students, earlier on in that sort of college process. Oftentimes there are organizations we'll hear from that have sort of upskilling or training programs for freshmen, sophomore, to really ensure that they can get really strong talent pipelines across different schools that they're recruiting from or different organizations. Does anyone in the attending group have any programs like that at their organizations?
I will give a shout out to this program called Genesis Works. It is nation wide, or their select regions. But Genesis Works is what we call a community-based organization that's working with high schoolers, but the high schoolers actually get to connect into the corporate space and do some internships or work at a corporate office or work in an organization. And I think that is just such an important aspect for the students, because not only are they in high school getting ready to go to college, but in high school they have the opportunity to have that exposure as to what might come for them after they graduate from college. And so I love Genesis Works for that mission. I also think about the Crystal Ray network. They also have similar elements of that, in which not only the students are spending time learning, they are also activating that understanding of the environment or the workforce. Should they get their degree, should they end up going into that specific place of employment in the future. So I wanted to shout out those two organizations.
Yeah, those are great examples.
I'll share one too that's a little bit more on the sort of industry and sort of corporate side is, and then for a particular, not just students, but when we think about, again, opening that aperture toward larger possibilities, thinking about, for example, and we're in November, veterans that are looking for employment post service. There are organizations that will invest in sharing or getting them skilled up to be coders. I believe Accenture was one of these organizations that did sort of coding boot camps for veterans that were separating from the military to come into their organization and become coders. And also the banking industry has done this outreach through a trade association partnership to help train veterans and their spouses to be engaged in sort of some of the entry level and then beyond roles within banks, which is another, an industry that identified a talent issue in which to bring more people and attract more people into banking. And so they look toward veterans, which I think is a really important piece. That this is also can be gender focused, ethnicity, race focused, and also those other dimensions of diversity that we talked about earlier to ensure that we are bringing the representative populations into our organizations.
Yeah. I know that we have a couple more minutes before we close out. I don't want to call on you, Natasha, but I'm going to throw this question to you. But I'm curious from your perspective, Suba, Pavani, Zach, Megan, anyone, where do you think we go from here? You know, what's next? What's important to prioritize? What's important to advocate on behalf of? I would love to hear your thoughts and, you know, maybe help us think more about our next steps as we consider the pending decision about affirmative action.
Well, I want to kick it off and say that I'm usually a cup half full person, but as it relates to this Supreme Court and this decision, I think that we really need to come to terms with the fact that it's probably going to get overturned. And if that really happens, then I'm going to say to you, waiting for our government to act and act quickly enough in response to it is really not the best strategy. And I would say to you, just as in the past, it is corporations that I believe can step up and play a much bigger role in figuring out how do you look beyond the factors that you can no longer consider in making sure you create equitable, even playing fields for underrepresented and minority talent to be able to find their way through, you know, education, higher ed institutions, and then into the workplaces.
Yeah, I'm with you, Suba, in that I think that, you know, there's no good substitute for race than race. And, you know, the outcomes from these other state bans have shown that. You know, I think we have to wait and see what the court says. You know, they may just simply limit affirmative action rather than ban it altogether. They may say, well, you have to, you know, there has to be some evidence that race has played a role in this person's lived experience. And, you know, I was kind of surprised in that moment when the UNC lawyer said, yeah, well, you could consider it in these kinds of ways. So, you know, perhaps there'll be a narrowing rather than an outright end. We'll see. But I also, you know, I just love the work that you're doing with Greenlight and the equity and, you know, the hiring process, because I think we can't just be thinking about the elites. You know, there's over 4,000 colleges in the country. Oh, you know, 200 of them are, you know, less than 5% are, sorry, it's late. I don't know if I did the math correctly there. But, you know, a small percentage of colleges, right, 5% are practicing affirmative action. And so, you know, thinking much more creatively about all of the talented young people who, particularly, as you mentioned, Winnie, you know, given the pandemic and the declining rates of enrollment in our community colleges, in the open access colleges, you know, there are, you know, it's not that there are fewer talented young people, right? It's that there, you know, there is other economic hardship. And I think the kind of it's less clear to young people, particularly who are coming from limited economic means or even middle class, lower middle class, you know, the sort of payoff to an expensive college education, even with financial aid, is not as clear to young people than I think it was even 10 years ago. So, you know, thinking about these other creative ways of both matching students to colleges, but also you know, potential employees to employers, thinking about non-4 degree signals of talent and skill that I think will increase access, and through those, I think, increase diversity. So I think we have to think about it at a lot of different levels. And then, you know, within higher education, we talked a little bit about some of those solutions as well in terms of admissions. But I really, you know, I love how EAB is looking at kind of across these different levels of colleges, because I think that's, and levels of education, because I think that's so important.
And I'll just add both of those points, that it's really important to continue organizational inclusion efforts, because when these this talent does come into the organization, or you do this outreach to bring the talent in, getting them to stay and feel like they can bring their authentic self into the organization is truly more important than, I think, even, or just as important as sort of the outreach to bring them in. And there's ways in which to think about how you offer things within, or programs or outreach or mentoring or other things we talked about earlier, for those populations of employees that come into your organization to ensure that they feel included. So if you do outreach to and bring in first generation college graduates, or those that are from low income or low middle income backgrounds, what are some of the things like benefits and offerings within your organization that signal that you're truly inclusive and care that these individuals stay in your organization and continue to contribute what they're bringing? So that's something we all, as organizations or those that work within the corporate space, can continue to have in our control, despite what may be happening externally.
Mm-hmm. I want to add for the higher ed space, for those who are listening and might have, the opportunity to influence the application process, I think evaluating the essays and redefining questions for students, especially the students that we're talking about today, making sure that those questions don't invite them to, really talk about their race or their identity from a deficit model, making sure that we're championing identities and individuals through the process. So if a student really wants to write about their love for anime, let that be known. Let that be a choice in which the student can make. But having an assumption or having a direction that forces an individual to bring up their race or ethnicity can also be harmful in this process too. So really just taking an eye at the different processes and policies that exist out there in that application process, and just start redefining, start, thinking about narratives and how they might show up. I also encourage you to think about mental health, because that plays a significant role here too in the way that people might start to describe themselves. And so there are some really great opportunities for us to move forward in such a positive way, but I only hope that we can just embrace change and embrace it quickly, because we learned how to embrace it quickly from the pandemic in the last two years. So, Pavani, do I pass it to you to close it out?
Sure. Yes, I went ahead and advanced to the final poll. And this one we won't be discussing because we're just at time now. Do you want to learn more about how Saramount helps organizations build more inclusive workplaces? I believe this poll should be active for you all. I think the radio buttons are live. I just want to thank everybody for joining this webinar. I know this is a very hot topic. We talked about a few innovations. I know one of the things we did not talk about was there's a bit of a self-destruct clause on affirmative action, meaning 25 years from the original case, which would have been 2003, puts us at 2028. Would love to see what kind of conversation we're having in 2028, which is not too far away, but hopefully is a much more kind of diverse and inclusive environment, both in the college level and in the employer level. So thank you all so much. Hope you all have a great afternoon, and feel free to contact any one of us. We are all live on the EAB website, and this has been recorded, so you can absolutely share it with others. So thank you again.